The original session number 4 took place on September 24 of the year 2014. Unfortunately, during the recording there was a slight mishap and miscalculation due to a oversight on my part. So this is a re-recording of session number 4. I'm going to be slicing in this re-recording with the original because I accidentally forgot to start recording until almost the end of the session. So today we are covering part 2 in Seeds from a Birch Tree by Clark Strand. This is a book on writing haiku and the spiritual journey. A bit of background: Clark Strand was a former Zen monk and also a former English teacher. So in part 2, we begin with Seeds from a Birch Tree. A haiku ought to make sense literally. It must be understandable right away. The objective image is the flesh and bone of haiku. Without it, there is no poem. Here is a haiku by Sister Benedicta, an Episcopal nun whom I came to know by chance when my wife noticed her reading a book of haiku on a New York City bus. Inside our chapel, with beams of wood and stone, seeds from a birch tree. The scene is simple. Through the door of the chapel, the seeds of the birch tree have blown, scattering across the floor. Above and all around them are the holy figures of a convent chapel, a place of prayer and contemplation. The truth of the literal and its wordless message is the meaning of the poem. In Christian terms, we might call it incarnation. I do not know whether this understanding is in line with current Episcopal theology, but monastics throughout the world will understand what it means. Likewise, anyone who follows the way of haiku long enough to come to appreciate this matter. In Buddhist terms, we sometimes express the truth of the literal with expressions such as, "This very body is the body of the Buddha," or by saying, "All beings have the Buddha nature." Sometimes we simply say, "Samsara," the world of suffering, is nirvana. When I had known my second teacher, a Japanese Zen master, for some years, the time came for him to give me a Buddhist name. When the moment came, however, he only laughed and said Kuraku, which is what he always called me anyway, being Japanese and unable to pronounce my name in English. In a strange sort of way, it seemed appropriate that my name had not changed, and so I nodded, feeling pleased. But when he continued to laugh, I wasn't sure. "You see," he said, "it really is the perfect name for you." Until that moment, it hadn't occurred to me to ask what, if anything, it meant in Japanese. When I asked, he replied, "Suffering and joy." Later that year, when I went to live in the monastery, I found the name less fortuitous than before. At odd moments during the day, always in the presence of others, my teacher would shout "Kuraku," and then ask, "Which are you now, Ku or Raku?" And I would answer one or the other, or both, or neither, and each time he and all the others would laugh. There were times when I simply went back to my room and cried. This sort of hazing continued for only a short time, but the matter came up again. One day, after I had been living at the monastery for a while, my teacher said that he thought he must have translated the name wrong after all. Actually, it meant samsara and nirvana. Still later, he retranslated it to mean sometimes samsara, sometimes nirvana. And then, finally, some years later, as we were having tea, he said, "You know by now, of course, that your name means only this. Samsara is nirvana." Like the name Kuraku, there are many ways of expressing the truth of incarnation, but in haiku, we always say it in the ordinary way. Something like, "Seeds from a birch tree." They also are beings. Their lightness and beauty fill the poem. And yet the real beauty, and the thing that makes it haiku, is that the seeds remain merely seeds. They are not symbols or a metaphor for something else. We may say incarnation, but really that is only birch seeds. They are beings too. Artists, poets, monks, and nuns, anyone who spends a lot of time in contemplation, will understand this point. It is nothing esoteric. The seeds are not something else. Just as they are holy. Coolness. And this section opens with a haiku by Cor van den Heuvel. Summer afternoon. The coolness of the newspaper from the grocery bag. A refreshing moment, plain and very simple. But what exactly does it mean? Even after having written haiku for 10 or 20 years, we may sometimes ask ourselves this question. The desire for explanation is very strong. Certain poems require no explanation. They stand for what they are. On a summer afternoon, the newspaper taken out of a grocery bag feels cool. If that is not meaningful, then much of life must not be meaningful as well. The task of the haiku poet is not to explain such moments, but to live them and to capture their life in words. Oars. This section opens with a haiku by Ken Steck. Oars flash in the sun. At the center of the lake, two men cease to row. This poem is a perfect example of objective description. There is nothing in the way. Oars flash. Two men stop rowing at the center of a lake. I find myself only wanting to look, not needing to say more. Cockscombs. Masaoka Shiki is sometimes referred to as the father of modern haiku, but the truth is his life barely poked through the bottom of this century. He died after a long bout with spinal tuberculosis in 1902, having just reached the age of 35. Nevertheless, his influence on the development of modern haiku was profound. Without the freshness and vitality of Shiki's sketch from life doctrine, haiku might not have survived into the 20th century, and it is doubtful whether it would have traveled from Japan to so many different countries around the world. For almost 10 years, a blue slip of paper marked one poem in my book about Shiki. Although the poem was composed in the classical 5-7-5 syllable form, because of its utter simplicity, it seems best to report it literally, along with Shiki's head note. Before the garden. Cockscombs must be 14 or 15. Masaoka Shiki, as translated by Janine Beichman. I loved this haiku from the very first time I read it. Although I had never seen cockscombs, I had some vague notion of what they looked like merely from the name, bright red flowers resembling a rooster's comb. I left the slip of paper there because the poem remained a puzzle. However much I loved it, I would never have quoted it as an example of haiku for fear of being ridiculed. I simply couldn't justify my fondness for it at all, even after having read the various commentaries by Japanese critics who contrasted, for instance, Shiki the invalid and the vertical stalks of fiery red autumn flowers in his little garden, the garden which, other than the faces of those who came to visit, was the only thing he had to look at during the last 6 years of his life, or the feeling, thought by some to be implicit to the poem, that the flowers would survive him into autumn. Privately, however, Shiki's cockscombs set a kind of personal standard by which I judged every poem I wrote. I felt certain that they had something to do with the haiku mind, but I had no idea what that something might be. Nearly a decade passed. My first marriage had ended in divorce, and after a time spent in the monastery, I left the monkhood and returned to haiku and the life of a layman, where I first began. Finally, I remarried. My wife and I had just moved into a new apartment in Manhattan with a garden in the back. The garden was a real treasure. The floor was red brick with a narrow raised border for flowers running along 3 sides. In back of it was, not another building, but the playground of a public elementary school. We planted daffodils and crocuses, jewelweed and dusty miller. We bought a bird feeder, and soon the garden was filled every day with sparrows. One day that first autumn, my wife came home from the Korean market with a large bunch of very unusual flowers, if you could call them that. They looked more like stiff bunches of red velvet folded over many times and affixed to the top of greenish-purple rods. When I tried to arrange them, the stalks were difficult to separate. I had to bear down hard with a knife, using both hands on the blade to cut through them. "What are these?" I asked. "Cockscombs," she replied. I was astonished. In that moment I realized that I had missed everything about the poem. I hadn't understood Shiki's flowers at all, not their weight or texture, not their color or the firmness of their stalks, nor the way they clustered together, making a precise count of them difficult from whatever angle, and impossible from any distance at all. I think it was then that I began to realize that Shiki's counting had been entirely without design. In his mind there had been no impulse to acquire or to assign any value over what there was before the eye. And once I understood this, I found that for the first time I also understood the photograph of Shiki, which had hung above my desk for many years. In the photo, Shiki is propped up on one hand, looking out from the veranda of his house. This is the meaning of the head note, before the garden. Shiki lying, just like this, leaning up on one hand looking out. The time seems to be dusk, or perhaps a very cloudy day, for the face is luminous. Over one shoulder a shutter looms white at the end of the room behind him. It is the eyes which always stir me most. Clear, calm, perhaps a little detached. Their vision is plain, even literal. It is a gaze in which intelligence, not yet having come to rest on any single thought, is everywhere apparent in the air about the body, which is also like an eye. Dark as it is, the photograph shimmers with its light. What I had missed about the Cockscombs all those years was the feeling of their reality, of their being fully present in the world, and connected to every other life by the season and the feeling of a single moment happening now. I knew then for the first time that the true significance of Shiki's cockscombs lay in the flowers themselves, and not in some other metaphorical meaning, however apt or true. It may take a lifetime to come to an understanding which is clear, direct, and very simple, but the primary work of haiku is always a restoration of the world. The famous modern critic Kenkichi Yamamoto once wrote, "Every masterpiece is a flower on a precipice." It is a tremendous assertion for the poet to have said, "There must be 14 or 15 stalks of coxcomb." After we read this poem, we cannot imagine the possibility that there could have been more or fewer coxcombs than 14 or 15. For some time I was very impressed with this statement, but now it seems to me that the American scholar Donald Keene may have come closer to the truth of Shiki's poem when he wrote, "Probably Shiki composed the haiku easily, even artlessly, as he looked at the garden, unaware that he had created a masterpiece of haiku. All that was required of the moment spent looking at coxcombs was a simple, artless exclamation on their number. The failure to assign one value over another gives the haiku a spiritual clarity and justice that transcends a mere accounting of the world. Moreover, the statement of a second number does not indicate indecision, but an extension and intensification of simple wonder by the interval of one stalk. The real power of the poem, then, lies not in the fact that it is a tremendous assertion, as Yamamoto has said, but that it is a very small one. In it there is no violence to the spirit or to the world. Ultimately, the number of flowers cannot be precisely reckoned, and it is this slight element of uncertainty, of humility, or simply play, which brings the moment to its peak and, with the smallest adjustment, aligns the human heart in friendship with autumn flowers and all the many beings of the world.
We have 2 more small sections to read, and then we can start playing with haiku. Daisies. Those who have done the meditation practice of following the breath know something about haiku. If you sit in a relaxed, upright position and watch closely as each breath comes in and goes out of the body, you will notice that, although the mind is sometimes dull and fuzzy, there comes a moment every now and then when it is not distracted, when it is not doing anything but following the breath. In such moments it may seem as though nothing could possibly be so clear. Almost at once, however, we seize upon this clear breath as the object of our meditation practice, as the goal we have been trying to achieve. Immediately the mind stumbles and ceases to flow. The problem is this. Rather than just looking at the breath, we want to watch ourselves looking at it. We want to include the self. We want some judgment. Gradually, however, we learn just to look at the breath without becoming too invested in whether we are really looking or not, without trying to determine whether or not the meditation is working and we are making progress. This is real looking. When we speak about oneness in meditation or in haiku, we tend to get locked into a fixed idea. That idea then becomes a block to understanding what oneness really is. Oneness is there already when we look at nature, a daisy for instance. We look at its whiteness, its yellow face, the green stem coming up to the ankle or the calves. Merely looking at a daisy, we achieve oneness on the spot. No need even to say achieve. Oneness is there already. Looking itself is oneness. Looking is the activity of oneness. A problem comes up, however, when we say to ourselves, I am looking at a daisy. When we do that, then it seems, in fact, that there must be some separation. I am here, and the daisy is there, and I am looking at it. When we say it that way, the oneness is lost. If we don't say it but continue looking, there is the realization of oneness with the daisy. Then everything is perfectly precise and clear. I learned to look at daisies from Nakagawa Soen Roshi, a Japanese Zen master whom I met briefly in 1982. I had been practicing Zen for a few years when I finally summoned the courage to attend my first week-long silent retreat at Dai Bosatsu Zendo, the monastery in the Catskills. I was nervous and afraid, but determined to get through it if I possibly could. As an added incentive, I was told that Soen Roshi would be in attendance for the first time in several years. I had, by that time, heard many stories about his eccentric style of teaching, and had learned, in particular, that he had written haiku all his life, and that many were considered to be fine Zen poems. Like his friend Nyogen Senzaki, he sometimes even used haiku as a way of teaching Zen. So it seemed as though I might possibly get the opportunity to ask his understanding of the Zen of haiku. It was a huge retreat. People had come from all over the world to attend it. Soen Roshi gave a talk every day, and the fourth day, according to tradition, was available for private interviews. When that day arrived, the students were called row by row from the meditation hall. Every few minutes a bell would sound, indicating that an interview was over, and a monk would strike another bell in the room where students waited in silence. Then the next person would rise and proceed down a long, polished corridor to the small room where Soen Roshi waited quietly, seated in meditation. I was at the end of the last row, the least senior of all the students. When my turn finally came, I positioned myself on the cushion in front of the bell as the others had done. But when Soen Roshi rang his bell, the monk struck twice in answer, signaling the end of the session. I was told to return to the meditation hall. The time allotted for the interviews was at an end, and I would not be able to speak with him alone. A few days later, the retreat was over. My teacher assured me that I had done very well, but the truth was I felt like a failure. I had barely made it through the week of silence and meditation. It was difficult to walk, and I had lost the feeling along the tops of both of my feet. I was sure that I could never endure such a thing again. My spiritual career was at an end. After the retreat was over, Soen Roshi was as playful as a clown. At one point, he stripped down to his loincloth in the meal hall in order to demonstrate the pathways of the acupuncture meridians and certain pressure points that could be used to relieve pain and stiffness between periods of zazen. Well, that's an image. Later that evening, he appeared at the back of the room in the guest house, wearing the devil mask from a no drama, a chenille bedspread pulled up over his head. while he recited a speech from Faust as the full moon rose over the lake. The next night there was a lunar eclipse, and I have heard stories about his behavior on that night, roaming around Beecher Lake like a ghost, but I did not witness any of that. I was exhausted and slept the whole night through. Yes, that just shatters the whole image of stern Zen monks, doesn't it? During all this time, he was continually surrounded by adoring American students, for whom he was by that time already a kind of legend. Once he sat next to me on the veranda before lunch, but we did not speak. He opened his mouth wide and tilted back his head as if swallowing the sunlight, and seemed almost to be asleep. I have seen dead people since that time. On one occasion, a tea master lying on a bed, with her head tilted back on the pillow, her mouth formed the shape of a bowl. At the time it struck me that she looked exactly like Soen Roshi had on the veranda. But for me, that is all beside the point. The next day I went for a walk down the mountain toward the gatehouse. It was then that I met Soen Roshi alone. He also was out just walking. As we neared each other, I summoned up my courage and introduced myself. I told him that I had hoped to meet him during the retreat, but that it turned out that it was not possible. He offered me his hand and we shook. Then, suddenly, I didn't have anything to say. I couldn't bear to ask him about haiku. It just didn't seem to matter. It seemed to me that this was the only encounter I would ever have with this man, and I was filled with sadness. I liked him very much. For some reason he made no move to depart and walk along, despite my inability to speak. Finally he bent over and pointed at a flower growing by the road. "What do you call this?" he asked. I couldn't speak at all. I had read Zen books on similar dialogues for years and could not begin to fathom them. It seemed the more of them I read, the less I understood. I wasn't even sure I had understood a single thing from any of his talks during the retreat. I suddenly felt as though I wanted to cry. But then he smiled and said, "No, just its name. What is its name?" I was so relieved. "Daisy," I answered. "It is called a daisy." "Daisy," he repeated, bending down close and drawing out the word as though he were tasting its flavor. "Beautiful flower, beautiful." And he continued on his way while I looked after him, his small back bending slightly this way and that as he climbed the hill. I do not remember when it first occurred to me that I had missed something in this encounter, but it must have been about the time of Soen's death in 1984. Still, it was only a decade after that I understood what he had meant. According to Takahama Kiyoshi, the proper subject of haiku is to sing the beauty of birds and flowers. However, few people in this life encounter circumstances which allow them to realize this flower mind. So, haiku is a gentle discipline to help the world along the road to its realization. It does not matter if it is sometimes regarded as a second-class art. It does not matter if that mind sees buildings, cooling towers, or a rose. What matters is that we realize it clearly while we are alive. When asked what his best haiku was, Soen Roshi always replied, "Hana no yo no, hana no yo naru, hito bakari." We'll pause here real quick. Who recognizes some of these Japanese words? Okay, which ones do you recognize? Just write them down quick, which ones you recognize. Okay, well, Hana, Aussie, you should know pretty well. The meaning is in the sound and rhythm, and the way the three parts make a whole, but it translates roughly: all beings are blossoms, blossoming in a blossoming universe. A scene of cherry blossoms on a hillside, or maybe in a park. If one truly understands a poem like this, it is unnecessary to study haiku. So the next little section that I'll read is called Haiku Mind, and then we can stop and discuss and get to writing haiku. When you count the syllables for a haiku on your fingers and select a season word, already you have touched the mind of Basho and all the other haiku poets of the past. How could it otherwise be than this? People ask me what haiku mind is, and I offer various explanations in accordance with the place and time. The truth is, it is only this. A haiku is a 17-syllable poem on a subject drawn from nature. This is both the simplest explanation and the secret of the art. In reality, however, this explanation is no different than what can be found in any good dictionary of American English. It reflects no hidden teaching. A 17-syllable verse form divided into lines of 5, 7, 5, and having a reference to nature or the season, is an explanation so simple and straightforward that anyone, even a child, can understand and practice it right away. I stress its importance again, not because it is difficult to grasp, but because it expresses the proper frame of mind for composing haiku, which is the one thing everyone forgets. Somehow it tends to become overcomplicated or obscured over the course of study. Or we develop the idea that we should go beyond it, beyond what is simple and plain. Therefore, it needs to be reclarified at every stage of practice before going on. A haiku is a 17-syllable poem. In July 1993, the poet Catto Josa passed away at the age of 88. One of the greatest haiku poets of this century, for many years he selected poems for the weekly haiku column of the Asahi Shimbun, one of Japan's largest newspapers. According to a newspaper story written by English haiku poet James Kirkpatrick, 2 weeks before he died, Shusen fell into a coma and never regained consciousness. Even while he lay unconscious, however, his fingers continued to move in the syllable counting fashion typical of Japanese haiku poets, bending the fingers inward toward the palm, then releasing them again, one by one. And that ends the readings for the day.